Gen X retro gaming. This is where it started. The Atari 2600, Superman. As an older Gen X, I was 7 years old Christmas of 1980 when we got the Atari 2600. By 1979, when Superman came out, I was 6 years old and the first Christopher Reeves Superman movie had come out a year earlier. You could fly, explore a city, capture criminals, and use X-ray vision. But once you actually played it, it was confusing and frustrating. You'd fly around random screens, not knowing what to do. Sometimes you'd just turn back into Clark Kent and couldn't use your powers. And then you had to find a phone booth somewhere in the city. It was pretty bad, and as a kid, you assumed it was your fault, not the game. But don't forget, this fridge today could play 1 million Atari 2600 games at the same time. Superman wasn't a great Atari game, but it was part of the beginning. Gen X retro gaming. This is where it started. The Atari 2600, Raiders of the Lost Ark. As an older Gen X, I was 7 years old Christmas of 1980 when we got the Atari 2600. By 1982, when Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, I was 9 years old, and the movie was still fresh in everybody's mind. You weren't just shooting things anymore. You had inventory, multiple screens, a real objective. You were Indiana Jones. But once you actually played it, it was confusing and frustrating. You needed 2 controllers. You had to read the manual. You could wander the desert for an hour and accomplish absolutely nothing. You'd fall into snake pits, get captured, and not even know why. As a kid, you assumed it was your fault, not the game. But don't forget, this toothbrush today has over 1,000 times the processing power of the Atari 2600. Raiders wasn't a great Atari game, but it was one of the first to try something bigger. Some call it the predecessor to Zelda. Gen X retro gaming. This is where it started. The Atari 2600, Pac-Man, or whatever this was. As an older Gen X, I was 7 years old Christmas of 1980 when we got the Atari 2600. Even today, Gen X will walk up to a Pac-Man, dump quarters in it, and enjoy playing. Man, the connection between the joystick and screen just worked, even in 1980. In June of 1982, I got my copy of the Atari 2600 Pac-Man for my birthday. Wow, I had Pac-Man at home. Unfortunately, as we figured out for most Atari 2600 games at this point, the game literally was nothing like the arcade version in any way. Add to that fact that it was clunky and the terrible joysticks made it floaty and hard to even move. But that didn't stop us from playing it since most of us were poor and an Atari cartridge was like getting to watch Star Wars again. For any older Gen Xer, Atari Pac-Man was a huge disappointment and clearly helped lead to the platform's demise. Gen X retro gaming. This is where it started. The Atari 2600, Gremlins. As an older Gen X, I was 7 years old Christmas of 1980 when we got the Atari 2600. By 1984, Gremlins was huge. The movie was everywhere. Gizmo was iconic. So of course, you had to have the game. You brought it home expecting movie magic. Instead, you got a dark, muddy scene with flickering blobs that were apparently gremlins. You wandered around the town at night trying to destroy nests before they hatched. The controls were floaty and impossible with the Atari 2600 joysticks. The enemies swarmed you. Half the time you couldn't even tell what was happening. It wasn't scary, it wasn't cinematic, it was confusing and frustrating. And like most bad Atari movie ports, you assumed it was your fault, not the game's. But don't forget, this microwave has hundreds of times more computing power than the entire 2600 that ran Gremlins. And somehow, we still played it for hours, because that's all we had. Gen X retro gaming. This is where it started. The Atari 2600, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. As an older Gen X, I was 7 years old Christmas of 1980 when we got the Atari 2600. By 1983, I was 10 years old, and video games were still seen as toys for kids. For the first time, you weren't the hero, you were Leatherface, walking across the screen, chainsaw running, hurting victims. The graphics were primitive, but the idea alone shocked people, parents, retailers, conservative groups. They didn't see video games as something for adults. They saw them as something for children. Stores refused to carry it. Some hid it behind the counter. Others wouldn't sell it at all. This wasn't just backlash. The brutal truth is that this was just a small example of the absolute evangelical religious cancel culture Gen X suffered and fought against before the turn of the millennium. This game tried to grow up before extremists were ready for video games to grow up, but don't get me wrong, this game was terrible. Please help my channel, like and subscribe, and check out these similar videos.